Let's bring in now presidential historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Doris Kearns Goodwin. You know, Doris, I'm not going to talk about a historical reference at the beginning of this. I'm going to talk about a pop music reference, maybe an obscure one. Of course, Barbara Streisand sang The Way We Were, but Gladys Knight and the Pips had their own version a year or two later. And she starts talking at the beginning of it. And she says, everybody's talking about the good old days, the good old days. And as bad as we think these days are, these are going to be our children's good old days. And I always think about that when people talk about how horrible of a time we are marching through. And I think of 2022, there's so much negative to look at. But I think about Zelensky, the hero, coming to Congress. I think about Liz Cheney, who could have just stayed in line, could have just followed marching orders, and she would still be in Congress. But she chose to do what she thought was the right thing, and she lost. I think of Cassidy Hutchinson. Now we find out late last night, Cassidy Hutchinson had escaped to New Jersey, tried to get help from her father, who was a Trump supporter. He wouldn't help her, tried to get help from others, wouldn't help her. And she was all alone. She said, I'm going to get destroyed. I'm going to get nuked. She testified anyway. And I think about our federal court system. Forgive me for this long windup, but there's some good news out there. There's some heroes in our midst. I think of one federal judge after another of all ideological stripes proving that Madisonian systems of checks and balances work still, in saying no and pushing back to Donald Trump time and time again. So that's my sermon about the good old days, some of them being today. I'm curious what your thoughts are on leadership in 2022.
I agree with you so much. It's a temperamental thing to think like you do, and I share that with you. I think it's so important for us to find those elements of strength when we're living. Sometimes we find it through history. We go back in time and think, oh, my God, look what they lived through, and they came through with greater strength. Sometimes we find it in our own moments, as you do. This was an extraordinary week for leadership, really, when we saw Zelensky come and all the reminders of the fact that 81 years ago, Winston Churchill came for the same reason, to shore up morale, to get support for Britain, to give a joint session of Congress speech was incredibly popular, as was Zelensky's. And you feel that we were fighting for democracy in World War II. We're fighting for democracy in Ukraine now. We're fighting for democracy at home. And I think this report that just came out, the power of it is in the narrative. You know, my hero in history, Barbara Tuchman, said that chronology is the spine of history, that you have to look at events as they happened to see cause and effect. And storytelling is the key of what that report has done. Maybe it left out things that we wish it had, but the real power that is really there is that people are going to see from cause and effect that Donald Trump was responsible not simply for what happened on January 6th, but for not accepting the peaceful transition of power and creating an alternate reality that many people were impelled to then buy into. And it meant that we lost time, we lost energy, we almost lost our system of government. So that I think, but we didn't, as you say. And that's where we have to remember. Lincoln said that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. If this report continues to educate public sentiment, as I think it will, storytelling is in our brain. You know, there's a reason why those people sat around before we had printed materials and at a fire to tell stories of the people who went before. It's the way we continue to tell ourselves to our parents, from our parents to our children to our grandchildren. And this story is so powerful. It'll be chapter 1 in the history of any books 50 years from now, 100 years from now. The real question is, what is chapter 2 going to be? Is chapter 2 going to say that we listened to this story, the public sentiment moved, a country was able to indict and get a response because the public sentiment was there, and that no president is above the law, and we moved on, and this will never happen again? That's what I wish. I wish, with a historian looking back, and I could see chapter 2 right now.
It is a brilliant insight, because you're right. People may be picking apart this report and maybe some of the things they think the committee should have done or should not have done. But at the end of the day, they told an extraordinary story that, as you said, is the first draft of history, and that historians for years to come will use as their primary reference. Now, you brought up Winston Churchill coming to the United States on Christmas Eve 1941, and he joined FDR at the annual White House Christmas tree lighting. And with a world at war, Churchill spoke of the importance of the moment, wishing all who were listening a Merry Christmas.
I spend this anniversary and festival far from my country, far from my family, and yet I cannot truthfully say that I feel far from home. Let the children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us, grown-ups, share to the full in their unstinted pleasures. Before we turn again to the stern tasks and formidable year that lie before us. And so, in God's mercy, a happy Christmas to you all.
If history doesn't repeat itself, Doris, it's rhyming very obviously this week. Isn't it remarkable? Churchill in 1941 and here Zelensky in 2022.
Wow, just hearing the gift of rhetoric that Churchill had, we heard that gift of rhetoric Zelensky had, the courage that Zelensky took to take himself away from Ukraine to come here. Churchill had to come over on a warship with U-boats all around in the treacherous waters, but they both knew it was so important because America held so much of the need of resources that both of them had. That whole visit with Churchill is such an extraordinary time because he completely disrupted the White House. He was there for 3 weeks. Can you imagine that? And he would stay up with Roosevelt until 2 in the morning. Finally, Eleanor would come in saying, "Isn't it time for you two little boys to go to bed?" Then the next day he would nap while Roosevelt had to run the country. So Roosevelt was totally exhausted. But the great moment that happens at in the part of his visit, they sign a declaration that all the 26 nations that are against the Axis powers are going to be together till the end. They will completely stay together, no separate peace. And they were calling themselves the Associated Nations, and no one liked that word. So finally that morning, Roosevelt awakens with a whole new idea. I'm going to call them the United Nations against the Axis powers. He's so excited, he has himself wheeled into Churchill's bedroom to tell him the news. But it so happens Churchill's just coming out of the bathtub and has absolutely nothing on. So Roosevelt said, "I'm so sorry, I'll come back in a few moments." But Churchill, amazingly, again with that gift for rhetoric, stands up straight, completely dripping from the tub, and says, "Oh, no, please stay. The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Can you imagine doing that? And the incredible thing is, I mentioned this on a radio program when Hillary Clinton was in the White House, and she called me up at the radio station and invited me to a sleepover so I could be in that room. So I actually slept, my husband and I, in Churchill's room, and it meant that I was sure he was in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. And then the next morning, I couldn't wait to go in the tub. And then I felt, I am truly in the presence of the greatness of the past. It was one of the great moments.
Oh, it sounds amazing. Well, presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, as always, thank you so much for being with us. We hope you have an absolutely wonderful holiday season. Thanks a lot.